All right, I want to welcome you to the first ever conversation for the Next Project. One of the things about the Next Project is we realize that we live in times that will profoundly change the way we live, we interact, we work, we do church. And I wanted to get some of the brightest and best minds out there to start having these conversations. I know a lot of conversations currently are based on best practices for the old paradigm. Now that we've had about 6 weeks, currently are based on best practices for the old paradigm. Now that we have 6 weeks of experience, sort of patching the boat. Now we're trying to figure out what does next like. I'm so grateful that my first guest is a real good friend of mine. He is my prayer partner. We pray together once a week when we can get the schedule to actually match. He is Pastor Paul Taylor of the Peninsula Bible Church. But the reason I invited Paul as the first guest is because his ministry has always been thinking about what does it mean to do new things and what does technology and impact happen. He leads a ministry called All Things New Tech that's been talking and working and dealing with new ideas. So I want to bring him forward. I want to have a quick conversation about what's next. Pastor Paul, how you doing, sir?
I'm great, Kaloma. Thanks for having me. It's really fun to be here with you and to be talking together.
Okay, good. One of the things I really respect about your ministry and your church was that when other churches were even debating and thinking and considering, you were the first church I know nationally that made the decision to not have Sunday services in place. You guys are a very thoughtful church. What has been the biggest impact of our current pandemic on ministry at PBC?
We're not a very fast-moving church. We make decisions typically very slowly. But I've been amazed at how our staff and really all the churches that I know of in the Bay Area have adapted so quickly. I mean, we received orders like everybody else. The county said something on a Friday about not meeting in large groups, and we processed that and immediately made the decision not to have church. We had already about 4 days earlier started figuring out we might need to figure out a live stream solution. So within about 48 hours, we had that up and running. And, by a week or two later, we had moved men's ministry, youth ministry, children's ministry, women's ministry, live stream on Sunday. Everything went online. It was incredible.
And just to give people scale, I mean, I think your church is about 1,500 people. It's not a small church. It's not 10 people moving. You had a lot of moving parts. So this change was significant. What do you think is going to be some of the long-term ramifications for church in general? Like, where do you see this going? I was sharing with somebody the other day, the printing press allowed the Bible to be printed and be spread out. So it was the tool, but it had a lot more impact across how the faith went over time. I mean, we focus a lot on the tools, live streaming and Zoom and other things, but what do you think are the impacts that are going to happen long term out of this?
Yeah, I like your phrase, patching the boat. I feel like we've been patching the boat for 6 weeks. We had to go from almost an entirely in-person ministry. We had very little online content to an entirely online ministry. And looking forward long term, I think we need to find a way to do both. We need to find a way. We deeply believe in relationships. We absolutely are convinced relationships happen best in person. But there's these tools, and now the whole world is used to interacting online. And so how can we use those things to drive people to engagement with each other in person once that's allowed? And how do we minister to people that don't feel comfortable with that? Even after some of the initial crisis is over, there's going to be people scared for months, if not years. So we're having those conversations. I'm not sure how, but I think our thought is, how do we use the digital tools to get people into deeper relationship, to build intimacy and connectedness?
Does that mean more staff? Or does that mean more resources? Does it make ministry more difficult to do because now you have these dual things that you have to sort of process through?
Yeah, that's the stuff we're thinking about. I think our staff right now is very demographic based. And so we have a pastor for children, we have a pastor for high school, a pastor for middle school, a pastor for women. And we're starting to think about, does that do we need to have some other way of thinking about things? Because in some ways our demographics are mixed. Everybody's in a home together now.
I never
And
thought.
yet stuff for children is still going to be different than stuff for high schoolers. And so how do you keep some of that demographic mixture, but also say, how do we minister more holistically? So maybe some of our job descriptions will change to have a little more elements to it.
Question for you, as somebody that's been deeply thinking about faith and technology over the past 2 or 3 years, what do you think this does for the overall Christian context in America moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity, but there's also a real danger. And I think it's the same issue. And to me, it's all about boundaries. One of the things we talk about at allthingsnew.tech is how technology seems to offer the possibility to transcend our limitations. And in a lot of ways, that's great. We've grown a lot by pushing our limitations farther. And yet there's also a danger in thinking that we can live without limitations. And so as I've seen the church respond to this crisis, we have these new limitations that we can't gather in person, but now ministry can happen any time of the day to any part of the world, to anybody all the time. And that's amazing. We have so many new opportunities to do stuff that we've never done before. We have people attending our worship services from almost all the continents, and we've never had that before. The boundaries are gone in a way, but then that's also a risk, because we as people aren't meant to live without boundaries. We are meant to be finite and limited. And so even as staff, we're thinking, how do we figure out when to rest? How do we take a Sabbath when literally ministry is everywhere all the time? And so figuring out what to do, when to do it, what your calling is, has never been more important, because we can only do what God is calling us to do. We can't do everything that there is.
Okay. Do you see any challenges? I love what you talked about, this always on ministry. Do you see any challenges around theological foundations if anybody can turn on and claim to be the church?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how do you know who's got something good to say? How do you know who's authoritative? I mean, all of a sudden everybody's voice is equal, and the only way you can evaluate is how many likes, how many watches. And that's hardly the best way to evaluate truth, by popularity. And yet, what other structures are there in a world where everybody's got a YouTube channel, everybody's got a Facebook Live, everybody's got something? And so discernment, I think, is going to be a challenge. I think you're right.
So, one of the things we've always talked about is that we live in an area that is basically godless, right? Statistics for the Bay Area indicate that before the pandemic, only 6% of people went to church, and we were definitely in the minority as far as active believers. Do you see this moment shifting it? Do you see more people coming back to the faith in our area and nationally?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly heard of that. I think it's hard to see it because it's hard to, all we have is numbers on our live stream. It's hard to count. But I do think the church is getting more publicity than it ever has. I mean, how we've responded to this, and mostly it's been very positive. I know we're working closely with the city, mostly through your efforts. I mean, you're one of the most connected people I know to the city and to the local efforts, and the partnership there has been a huge blessing. So the city now sees us as a resource, where a couple of years ago that wasn't true. So I think the church is getting some visibility that it hasn't, in a good way. There's going to be negative visibility too. I just saw an article that a bunch of churches are suing the governor for shutting them down. So
yes.
There's going to be negative stuff and positive stuff.
And that's an interesting case, because they wanted to know, that case is basically saying, what gives the government authority to stop church? That's one of the tenets of America. And we understand that the virus is a valid reason to stop, but their order is stopping it. And how do we balance that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really complicated.
So I think a big impact that we're going to deal with somewhere along the line is the separation of church and state, and what does that look like? You know, um, a lot of our viewers probably don't know, but you are evangelical, and I know, in having worked and prayed and lived with you and your community, I understand that that word has this broad connotation, and sometimes we sit on the negative side of it. Um, but we see a lot of churches that are fundamentalist and evangelical across the country not pushing against some of this stuff. What do you think about that? Where do you see this going? Where do we go? Like, from your perspective, I have a perspective, but I want to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was really simple. When the orders first came out, it wasn't even an order, it was a request from the government to say, please don't meet in large groups. And we didn't interpret that as telling us we couldn't have church, because church is not an event. Church is not a Sunday morning gathering. It's a community of people that stay connected to each other and to God. And so for us to say we want to partner with our government to abide by their request, to not gather in large groups, and we'll gather other ways. And so we have this technology to gather that's incredible. And so we'll do that. And so we to us, it was very clearly just a submission to local authorities issue. We wanted to be submissive. We wanted to partner with them. We didn't see it as a challenge to our authority. In fact, it's interesting. I've done some research in the 1918 pandemic. All the same things happened. Churches were asked to close. They were asked to not meet. Some churches fought against that. And other churches said, you know what, we can do this. And they would write sermons out. They would write home worship guides. They would send them to their people for families to worship together in their homes, which, you know, it's 100 years later, and we're basically just doing the same thing. We're just videoing it instead of writing it, but some things never change.
So I have, one of the things that I think is going to be a significant impact is we have unprecedented unemployment.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will assume because we live in Silicon Valley, that's not an issue. But I'm hearing of Yelp laying off 2,000 people. Sequoia, who is a major VC, sent a letter out at the end of February, beginning of March, like, you better take care of your own funding, because VCs are not going to fund a lot of startups. How do you see that impact the myth of, like, the Silicon Valley save everything, venture capitalist startup culture? Do you see that having any impact, or how do you think the church meets people that had that dream popped?
Yeah, I mean, man, I think you're absolutely right. I feel like there's a wave coming on the horizon, and we just don't even know how big it is. I mean, I think the kind of financial impact on our area, I mean, it's already been an impossible area to live. Maybe it is a market reset. Maybe it's, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I think you're right. Something big is coming, and I think it's up to the church to be ready. We don't have to predict what's going to happen, but we have to be ready to help people when it happens. And we have to be ready to sacrifice and reach out and pick people up, do whatever we can to help out.
Yeah. I have to ask you a question about delivering the gospel and people receiving the gospel.
Yeah.
I am still struggling preaching to an empty room. Then I'm also struggling with the response, not so much the amens and stuff, but how do people accept Christ? How do people have a deeper connection to community? How do people join in and become part of something? And I'd love to hear your take on that.
Here's where it's an advantage to be a white preacher, because I'm used to preaching to a room that doesn't say anything in return. So preaching to an empty room is not that different than my normal experience.
It's a struggle.
They wouldn't say amen even if they were there, so I'm not missing it. But to your point, I felt the same thing. I mean, preaching to a camera is not the same. And every pastor I've talked to just hates it. But what are we going to do? I mean, this is the season we're in. But I can't wait till we're able to be back together in person. I mean, that's just going to be great. It's a challenge.
It's a challenge. How do you think the church can support people like loneliness and mental issues are a significant challenge right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're going to be continually exacerbated as we continue to go through this. Tell me what your thoughts on that, how the church can help with that. How do you see us? Because, we have to become more of people's lives now. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's really a challenge. I mean, video calls, phone calls, they're great for relationships you already have. And I know in some ways, even for myself, relationships that were less active have reawakened. I'm talking with my family more than I used to. But I think what we're missing is that kind of, you get people in the same room and they bump shoulders and they start a conversation and they make a connection. I don't know how that happens online. And so we need to think about how to create those opportunities, how to create opportunities for people to make connections they didn't expect. And I don't know if we have the good tools for that. I don't know how we can do that. I think people who are alone in this time, it's a desperately lonely time. I've heard so many people struggling with that. The church has to minister to that.
You talked about our tools in the last statement. I believe that we've used a lot of wrong tools and different tools and old tools. Is there any tool that you felt that we were misusing, or any tool that you felt like wasn't the right fit, but we were forced to use it? And is there anything, if you could make a perfect tool to do ministry at this time, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've been using a lot of Zoom, and there's certainly some security issues with that. But those don't concern me as much as the theological issues, or how do we create a community. Something where, I guess, if there's a tool where we could have those kind of spontaneous interactions. Some of our people have been getting together on Zoom before church, like a virtual patio where they just hang out. So stuff like that, maybe, where you can just check in and you don't know who you'll interact with, but then you could have a conversation one-on-one. I don't know, maybe like a party Zoom where there's people in the room, but you could focus on one conversation. That would be interesting.
That would be interesting, because one of my big complaints with Zoom is it's designed very well to do business communication, which is very formal and very one-on-one. It doesn't have the interact. If I talk and you talk and we start talking together and it gets exciting, it totally falls apart. And like, aside from some other things that are more a technical discussion, that's the one thing that like breaks it for me. It's like, we can't have this like back and forth without a green box here and then a green box here. It's more volleyball than like life.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. That's exactly right.
So we're at the end of our time. We were trying to keep these to about 15 minutes, half an hour at most. We are at 12:18 already. So do you have anything that you really see as next?
I think we just need to be in prayer and discernment. I think we need to be asking the question, what is God doing? Like you say, we've been patching the boat for 6 weeks. Now we have the opportunity to really think about what's next. And I haven't heard anybody with the answers, but we need to be asking the questions. I'm personally more of a fan of questions than answers. And when we start asking the right questions and giving space to God, for God to speak to us, I think we're going to be surprised. It's going to take some risk. It's going to take some trial and error, some experimenting. Sometimes you got to throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. But God uses crisis in powerful ways. He always has. And so it's up to us to listen to him as to how he leads us out of this, through it, and what opportunities for the gospel emerge.
Man, Paul, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you probably have 8 million Zoom calls like we all do, but thank you. You've been so insightful today. Thank you.
It's been really great to hang out. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us for our first project together. What I wanted to tell you is that we'll be back on Thursday. My guest will be Pastor Charlie Hames from BB Memorial in Oakland. Very progressive gentleman that does amazing ministry. Again, different context than Pastor Paul Taylor, but it's going to be a great conversation. Again, can't wait to see you on Thursday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, or I guess it'll be Pastor Charlie Haynes. Thank you so much for being part of the Next Project Conversations.